Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So in this video I am talking about Heretics of Dune, which is the 5th book in the Dune series. So if you happen to watch my last video about God Emperor of Dune, you might know that I didn't love the huge time jump and I wasn't all that into that book in general as compared to the other ones. So I was a little hesitant when this one had another really big time jump and another new entire set of characters. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by this one. So Heretics of Dune takes place 1500 years after the end of God Emperor and the fall of Leto II. So some of the events of Leto's Golden Path, the things that he predicted in the other book, have taken place. This great scattering happened where there was this famine and humanity kind of spread out into the universe. So the ideas of diversity and all of that are playing out the way Leto said they would and the way they needed to. And now we're at a point where those people who had broken off and scattered out into the world are coming back to the old empire. And that coming back has caused conflict. And the first truly major, in the grand scheme of things, break from the peace that Leto promised. So this book largely takes place on two planets, Gammu and Arrakis. So Gammu, I don't know. It used to be Sheeana Prime. It used to be a Harkonnen planet, and that sort of dark history certainly colors the way it is now. It's described as being kind of chaotic and patchwork and thrown together in like surface level appearances, but really everything's very calculated and manipulative and very aware of human psychology. So Gammu is one of the places that we mainly see half of our characters on. The other half are on Arrakis, which is the current name for Arrakis, also known as Dune. And as Leto said, Dune has been restored to a desert planet. You know, the worms have returned, perhaps not at their full strength as the original Dune, but Dune, which was lush and green in the last book, is a desert planet once again. And that also comes with desert people who are hardened in the way the Fremen were. And another factor that's centered on Arrakis is Leto's religion, which the Bene Gesserit, in their very cynical way, describe as the most successful religion ever. And really them describing it as that, I can see now looking back on it, was sort of a hint into the Bene Gesserit motives moving forward from here. So all these years later, Leto's influence and the future he created through his second sight, through his prescient vision, is still affecting people. It still has a hold on this universe. So there are three major political powers to talk about in this book that are kind of the big players driving things, the big players that are clashing when we come to the end, which are the Bene Gesserit, the Tleilaxu, and the Honored Matres. And there are other forces in existence. There's Ix Guild, the fish speakers still exist, the Reikian priests are there on Arrakis. But it's pretty clear to us early on that those aren't really legitimate players. They are not forces to be reckoned with, and we don't deal with them quite as much in this book. So first we have the Bene Gesserit, which also happen to be our main lens into the story. A lot of what we're seeing, we see from the point of view of the Bene Gesserit or people who are loyal to the Bene Gesserit. So as we already know from the other books, they are this body of women. They have their breeding projects to sort of find certain traits and get humanity to work for them and to sort of meet the ends of the Bene Gesserit goals, which at this point are to just maintain their order and to ensure that they will survive whatever changes come. So they're still breeding, they're still trying to figure out a way to have some sort of spice control. Spice is still a factor at this point, though the Tleilaxu have figured out a way at this point to produce their own spice, but we will get to that later. They're still doing their breeding projects. That's still a huge part of their goals. And we see on Gammu a Gola project. Yes, another Gola project. So Teraza is the head Reverend Mother of this order, and we know pretty immediately that she has some big plans with her Gola project, which I will talk more about, and it's got something to do with Rachis and this person, this very important person that has been born there. But I think for the first time we also see within the Bene Gesserit some of the discord about the decision making, because not everybody agrees with what Teraza is doing. It's really not until we get towards the end of the book that we fully understand her motives and what her plans have been the whole time. But she's definitely clashing with other individuals in the Bene Gesserit for two main reasons. One is that I think some of them think she pushes a little too close to the line of accidentally producing another Kwisatz Haderach, like a Paul Atreides, using the Atreides bloodline. And they definitely don't want that to happen because Paul did not work out for the Bene Gesserit. And second, they don't want Teraza to mess with the worms. So clearly the worms are playing some sort of a factor in this, but there are those among the Bene Gesserit who believe that you could awaken the Leto consciousness that is within every worm, and they definitely don't want the tyrant to return. So that's like an interesting glimpse into the politics of the Bene Gesserit, which I think is a great addition to this book. So then we have the Tleilaxu, who make the Golas, so they're obviously involved in the Gola project also and have their own motivations and secrets within that. We get some glimpses inside of their inner structure too, things that we've never seen before in the other books. We get to see their leadership and what's going on the inside of the Tleilaxu. We discover that not only are they producing Golas and sort of trying to manipulate things with their Golas, as we've seen in several books before, we also discover that they're using their Gola project in some way to be sort of immortal, in that they are have long memories just like the Bene Gesserit do, because they're being reborn and reborn and reborn. So our main spokesperson for the Tleilaxu is Waf, and he has that long memory, and through him we see that the Tleilaxu have really been biding their time for thousands of years, and that they have their own religious beliefs that have been unknown up until this point that's driving them. And they believe that the pieces are falling into place for them to ascend to the top of the pack, to the leadership, and to spread their religious beliefs, which center around Leto himself not being a god, but being a prophet. But yes, to that end, they get involved in some shady alliances. So the other important faction that makes up the primary villain of this book are the Honored Matres. So the Honored Matres were from the Scattering. So they are descendant from Bene Gesserit who went out into the universe, and their descendants are just now returning. So they're very dangerous and powerful and have morphed into something very different than what the Bene Gesserit of the Old Empire are. And the Honored Matres are power hungry and sort of a faction that is controlling, trying to control everything, which we know is a theme that has come up in Dune so many times, of control versus chaos, and ultimately chaos and diversity and surprise seems to be better for humanity's survival. And they use sex, some sort of mystical way to control people, and to control people absolutely in a way that the Bene Gesserit can't do and wouldn't attempt to do, because they see the danger in that. Okay, so let's talk about the Gola project. Yes, there is another Duncan, Idaho in this book. I'm honestly getting a little tired of Duncan, Idaho. There's so many Duncan, Idahos. But anyways, Duncan, Idaho is the first of two characters that provides a central point to the plot. So he is on Gammu, being raised and trained by the Bene Gesserit and their people. He came from the Tleilaxu, obviously, and, you know, it's hinted very early on that, yet again, the Tleilaxu have planted something inside the Gola that the Bene Gesserit don't know about. There always has to be a twist with these things. So this time we see the Gola as an adolescent when we first meet him. Some years pass over the course of the book, but he's a teenager for a lot of it, which is different from the Duncans we've seen before. He's also not awakened to his pre-Gola memories, which we haven't seen firsthand before either. So he's training, he eventually discovers that he is a Gola before his memories are awakened. So that's an interesting thing to reckon with in his mind, that he's had this whole life of his own experiences, and he knows there's these other experiences inside of him that he hasn't been able to unlock. Yeah, so the Bene Gesserit obviously have big plans for him, and it seems to have something to do with this other character that is on Arrakis. So along with Duncan, we have two main characters who are sort of in charge of him and looking over him over the course of this book. They are one of the Bene Gesserit, Lucilla, and Teg, who is a military leader who has been loyal to the Bene Gesserit his whole life. And what's interesting, sort of shows all the very careful planning that the Bene Gesserit do, is that Lucilla was bred and created to look like Duncan, Idaho's mother, and Teg looks a lot like Leto the First, who the original Duncan served and was fiercely loyal to. So Lucilla, on one end, is an imprinter, meaning that she's supposed to have sex with Duncan, I guess, and use her skills to make him like loyal or obedient to her. She never succeeds in this because of Teg, who kind of messes it up for her. So Teg is such an important character, and we find out later that Teg, you know, it's not just a coincidence that he looks like Leto the First. He has Atreides blood, and we know anyone in the Atreides bloodline is going to be important. So he's very smart and well trained. He has the like men-taught human computer kind of awareness, and, you know, some of the gifts that come along with being an Atreides. If you remember, the first Duncan, Idaho Gola was awakened when he tried to attack Paul, because obviously that would go completely against his pre-Gola memories. I guess we have seen a Gola pre-awakening, like the first one. We mostly saw him before he woke up, but that was so long ago I kind of forgot about it. But anyways, it seems pretty obvious early on that they're setting up Teg to be the person that Duncan, you know, rebels against in order to awaken his pre-Gola memories. And when things go sideways and their plan to get Duncan to Arrakis doesn't work out, Teg is really the main force pulling the pieces back together. He is extremely important. Terraza of the Bene Gesserit really puts all of her trust in him, and in the end, his loyalty pays off. And what also pays off is his ability to do the unexpected, which becomes a very important theme. So then the second character that the plot centers around is called Sheeana. And Sheeana is a really interesting addition to the plot because she doesn't seem to come out of the Bene Gesserit breeding. I think almost all the main characters we've seen so far have come out of nobility, and that's where the Bene Gesserit sort of put their efforts. But Sheeana is a peasant girl from Arrakis. She's basically an unknown until her gift is discovered. And her gift, which was prophesized by Leto that she would emerge at some point, is that she can control the worms. So no one rides the worms anymore because, you know, that's sort of sacrilegious since Leto is inside all the worms. But Sheeana's the first person in a long time to ride a worm. She talks to the worms, she does her worm dance to call them, you know, the sort of rhythmic thing that we've talked about before, and sort of the rhythms of how you move on the sand, drawing a worm to you. And the worm listens to her. When she tells it to stop, it stops. When she, you know, gives it orders, the worm follows. So this is quite remarkable, and when she's discovered by the priests on Arrakis, you know, she's taken as a messenger of God and as this holy person. And Sheeana hides her true roots, which were that she was a peasant girl in the desert and her whole village was eaten by a worm except for her. But the priests don't know that. They think that she sort of came out of nowhere from the desert, which adds to her mystique and everything. So Sheeana's very interesting in that she's just been plucked into this plot, and she's so important. The Bene Gesserit are intensely interested in her. You know, their Duncan project has something to do with her. So she's a big deal, and she offers a lot of the sort of amazement and awe that we got in the first book of Dune, like the build up to the first time we see someone ride a worm in that book. That feeling was really recreated with Sheeana because people witness her do these things and everyone's completely amazed by it, and those scenes are really beautiful and some of my favorites in this book. I do think Sheeana kind of trails off a bit towards the end, you know, similar to Sheeana and some other characters in the past for Frank Herbert. They start out really cool, they have a great setup, an interesting story, and then we just never see their perspective again for a really long time. So we don't get into Sheeana's head later in the book, and we kind of lose sight of her, which is a bummer because, again, I thought this was a really interesting character. Hopefully we can explore her more in the future. So then we have the faction on Arrakis that is connected to Sheeana. So we have Tuek, who is a Rakian priest, and we sort of see through him this kind of worship that emerges among them of Sheeana. Then we see Waf of the Tleilaxu go there. You know, his religious beliefs are really tied up in Arrakis, so he is certainly in awe of Sheeana and, you know, has his own plans for her and what it means that she's arrived now. You know, he thinks this is the sign of the Tleilaxu's ascension. And then the other main character who's around Sheeana is the Bene Gesserit O'Drady, who is Teg's daughter, also has the Atreides bloodline, and shares a lot of his traits and ingenuity and skills that Terraza wants. So she is really an interesting character and becomes the most central character, especially in the latter half of the book. We see so much through her perspective. You know, she is right in the thick of things and sort of has to be the puppet master in really tight political scenarios. And since we're inside of her head, we get to see some of the internal struggles that aren't always revealed with the Bene Gesserit. With O'Drady, she has this appreciation for art that is akin to love and emotion, which are things the Bene Gesserit sort of try to avoid. So we see her kind of standing apart from them in that way. We also see her have religious doubts. You know, the Bene Gesserit, they're very cynical about religion. Their thoughts are that religion is sort of a tool. They use it to control people around them. And when we're inside of her head, we see that even as she's using those tools, she's really not sure. But she is very important. You know, she gets Sheeana on her side to the point where she wants to be a Reverend Mother of the Bene Gesserit. She is Teraza's person on the ground in Arrakis, and she has to make a lot of big game time decisions there. And again, like Teg, we see her value in her ability to do the unexpected. So overall, this book is really chronicling the end of Leto's great peace. You know, there's been little skirmishes and battles and things here and there, but in the great scheme of things, the universe has been tamed since Leto. And with the return of the Scattered Ones, all of that is changing. So, you know, everybody, the characters keep talking about how they still feel Leto's grip on their lives. They still feel the control he has. And we're just now seeing that begin to crumble. So the first big blow is the Honored Matres attacking Gammu in an attempt to kill Duncan, Idaho. So they are really trying to kill Duncan, Idaho. They are trying to take control of the old empire, and he is a threat to that. Why? We find out. So Teg, Lucilla, Duncan, they escape. They're in hiding. Teg awakens Duncan's pre-Gola memories, so he has to reconcile this thousands and thousands of year old existence with the memories that he has right now on Gammu. And really all we know at this point is that Duncan has to get to Arrakis, and Teg's orders are to get him to Arrakis. So there's this whole thing, they have to split up and sneak around to try to get to a no ship, which is a ship that cannot be tracked by prescient vision. And that sort of leads us to the end of the book with a second major battle on Gammu as they leave. And I'll talk more about the end in a bit. But something that I've mentioned that becomes very important in this book is the idea of the unexpected, that humanity is at its best when it's surprising. And that seems to be a uniquely Atreides trait, to be able to think on your feet and do what surprises and really keep your enemies on your toes, which is why Teg and O'Drady are so important to Teraza's plans and why they're so key to getting to the ending of this book. You know, they have that untraceable Sheeana blood. They are harder to predict in general, but they also have that kind of ingenuity, that's something inherent in their personalities that allows them to really truly be unpredictable. Which, when we're talking about breaking from control being a major theme in all the Dune books, that is very important. So again, we see the role of history. Frank Herbert loves to explore that clearly. It comes up in every single one of his books. In this one, a lot of the history references and the epigraphs are from Dar es Balat, which was sort of the discovery of Leto II's secret history underground and the kind of journals that he was writing in the last one. It's interesting because so much time has passed that things in the history of like what we read, which is now history to the people in these books, it had been forgotten and then remembered again with the discovery of Dar es Balat. So there's this very cyclical thing happening there, kind of lining up with Dune being desert and then not desert and desert again. Like everything comes back around. And at one point in the book, which is really important for O'Drady, is that when Sheeana takes O'Drady to ride a worm with her, the worm kind of takes them where it's going to go, and the word takes them to the location of Sietch Tabor, you know, the Sietch that we're most familiar with in all of the early books, seemingly so long ago. And when O'Drady is inside, it's as if the worm taking her there was Leto himself leading her to his words, his message. And it really comes home to her that Leto still controls everything, that the consciousness in the worms is still a force in the world, whether the common people know it or not. And I think that's really when O'Drady begins to understand Herotz's plan and the significance of it. Because Leto's remaining control is the central, real, legitimate conflict in this, even more so than the honored matres. And then we see, you know, the history as we knew it changing a little bit because we get new information we never had before. For instance, the way that the Tleilaxu are actually making the golas. The axolotl tanks have been a huge mystery this whole time, and the question gets raised in this book, where are all the Tleilaxu women? Have you ever seen a Tleilaxu woman? And what is revealed is that the Tleilaxu women are the axolotl tanks. And it seems like grotesque, the process of these women being axolotl tanks, but that secret is so important because that's how they're making golas and that's how they're making spice. So that is a huge card for the Bene Gesserit. Okay, so let's talk about the ending. So, Teg goes through this traumatic experience with the honored matres, where they're sort of probing him in some way. And similar to like the spice agony of, you know, sort of awaking the higher consciousness in Bene Gesserit, we see something greater, sort of beyond human, awakened in Teg. And that potential was, of course, in him because he is an Atreides. So now Teg, for the first time, consciously has a second sight. He is seeing the future one step ahead of him. And that is key to him saving Duncan and getting him to Arrakis. So then, on Arrakis, meanwhile, the honored matres come. They set their attack. And we discover that they are willing to destroy an entire planet to get rid of Duncan, Idaho. So they gruesomely kill Heratza. They literally slice her in half. And they take control of the major cities in Arrakis. So what we discover, the big secret of the book, the Tleilaxu planted inside of this Gola not just his pre-Gola memories from the days of Leto I and Paul Atreides, but he has his serial memories from all of his lives with Leto II, all of his lives and all of his deaths. So there's all this knowledge in him that is released upon imprinting. But that doesn't go to plan because he ends up having sex with an honored matres instead of a Bene Gesserit, which works out for the best, honestly. Because then we see that Duncan's other big gift, which becomes very important, is that he is sort of adaptively resistant to the sexual control that the honored matres has over people, and that he can sort of exert that control over others. I thought about this in the last book, but sort of forgot to mention it, that Duncan Idaho as a character seems very, like, wish fulfillment for, you know, the male readers of this book, in that all the women are just, like, constantly fantasizing about having sex with him, and he's just, like, the ultimate, top, best, whatever. So you sort of get a sense that he's, like, a window into, like, fantasizing about being this, like, ultimate sex god, manly man or something. So basically, Teg and O'Drady have to be improvisational. They have to act on their feet. And Teg is loyal to Taratsa's orders till the end. So originally, Duncan, Idaho was meant to be bait. They were going to put him on Arrakis to bait the Honored Matres into destroying the planet for them. But then Duncan had these secret abilities, and he was therefore more important than the Bene Gesserit even expected. So Teg sacrifices himself to allow them to get away. Duncan, Sheeana, O'Drady, and one worm from Arrakis, controlled by Sheeana, escape before Arrakis is destroyed. And as it turns out, that was Taratsa's plan all along. So this seems to happen at the end of all of these books, but the genetics, the potential reproduction that's going to come out of these characters is very important. The Bene Gesserit's very interested in that. So now we have Sheeana, who genetically is able to control the worms, and obviously they want her children to control the worms. And they have Duncan, who genetically can resist the Honored Matres, which is very important to the survival of the Bene Gesserit. Of course, we see some dark sides to the breeding programs for the first time. Like there's this faction on Gammu that are bred to work in the sewers, and that just seems really sad. But yeah, I mean, in the nobility of this world, we're seeing these important selected traits similar to Sheeana's ability to not be seen by prescient vision. But yeah, so in the end, O'Drady's in charge, and the Bene Gesserit have majorly won this battle. They have crushed all of their enemies in one fell swoop and gained all the power for themselves. So they know the secret of the Axletal tanks, and they can use that for themselves, which means their own Golas and their own spice, independent of the Tleilaxu. Waf from the Tleilaxu has died. Their plans of ascension have completely fallen apart because Sheeana is on the side of the Bene Gesserit. And the worms, except for their one worm, are all gone. And that is really the central core of this story, is that Leto's consciousness in those worms was still controlling the way the world was moving. They were still tamed. They were still under his foot. They could feel a magnetic influence from Arrakis. And now that Arrakis is destroyed, all the worms are gone except the one that the Bene Gesserit took, the one that they have control over. Just the diminishing of numbers apparently will lessen Leto's prescient creative control. And because they have the only worm, and they have the messenger of God, Sheeana, they now have restored the religious control that they enjoyed pre-Leto. The religious center is theirs once again. Remember, Leto's religion was the most successful, was the most lasting, and really they own it now. So their plan is to turn Chapter House, which is the Bene Gesserit planet stronghold, into their own version of Dune, to have their own worms with their Sheeana descendants to control them. And of course they want Sheeana and Duncan to end up together, to mingle their genes. Duncan is resistant to that at the end of this book, but we'll see what happens in the next one. Okay, so that was a lot of information about this book. I had a lot to say about this one. There was a lot of characters, a lot going on. I'm sure I didn't cover half of it. But I really enjoyed this one. I was kind of out on God Emperor, and I understood why people were saying, you know, just read the first 3 books. But this one, it brought me back in. We sort of started fresh. We don't have this ultimate all-knowing character of Leto anymore. It felt like a return to the original Dune book, in that there was all this very interesting politics going on with all these characters and emotion intermingling with those kind of political decisions. And I was really interested in the characters that were introduced. O'Drady is a great character. Sheeana is very interesting and I think has a lot of potential. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking now that this one was worth reading God Emperor for the context, even if I didn't enjoy that one as much. So the next book, and the last book in the Dune series, finally, book 6, is Chapter House Dune, which my next video will be on. And I sort of peeked at the first couple pages. I haven't really started it yet. I just kind of looked into it, and it looks like there's not going to be a huge time jump, that we're continuing with the characters of Heretics of Dune, which makes me very, very hopeful for this, for sure. Okay, well, I think that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.